Emily Harrington slammed her palm flat against the glass desk and pointed at the door. "Get him out of my building, right now." Two security guards seized the janitor by the arms, the same quiet man who 10 minutes earlier had saved her company from a $200 million collapse in front of every investor she had left. He didn't fight. He didn't beg. He simply looked her dead in the eye and said one sentence she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget. 10 days later, that single decision would nearly bankrupt her entire empire because the janitor she threw into the rain wasn't who she thought he was. Not even close. Before we begin, do me a favor and comment the name of the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels tonight. And if you still believe a good man can be underestimated by the whole world and still come out standing, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. Trust me, you'll want to see how this one finishes. The elevator doors opened at 4:47 in the morning, and Michael Carter stepped out into a building that didn't know his name. He pushed the cleaning cart, the way he pushed it every day, steady, unhurried, the wheels whispering across marble that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. The lobby of Harrington Global Technologies was still dark, the great glass towers of downtown Chicago sleeping around it, and for 1 hour before the suits arrived, the building belonged to him. He liked it that way. "Morning, Mr. Carter," said the night guard, an old Marine named Walt, who was the only man in that building who ever used his name. "Morning, Walt. Cold one out there." "Colder in here." Walt tapped the thermostat with a knuckle. They cut the heat again, saving money. Michael almost laughed. A company worth billions cutting the heat by 2 degrees. "Saving money," he repeated. "That's what they call it." He wheeled the cart down the east corridor and started his rounds. Empty the bins. Wipe the glass. Straighten the chairs that 100 important people had left crooked the night before. Somewhere above him, 40 floors up, engineers were about to walk in and pretend they'd built an empire with their own 2 hands. Michael had learned a long time ago that the people who kept a place alive were almost never the people whose names were on the walls. He knew that better than anyone, because 5 years ago, Michael Carter's name had been on a lot of walls. I didn't think about it much anymore. He'd trained himself not to. But some mornings when the building was quiet, and his hands were busy, and his mind had nowhere else to go, the old life came back to him whether he wanted it or not. He'd been an aerospace engineer once. Not a good one, a great one. The kind they flew across the country to consult when a system failed, and nobody could figure out why. He'd designed emergency override software for military aircraft, the kind that kept pilots alive when everything else went dark. He'd walked into rooms full of men with 3 times his education, and solved in 20 minutes what had stumped them for 6 weeks. And then, his wife died. That was the whole story, really. That was the fork in the road. One phone call on a Tuesday afternoon, and everything that had mattered stopped mattering. Because there was a 4-year-old girl at home named Sophia, who now had exactly one parent left in the world, and that parent could either chase a title across 3 time zones, or he could be there when she woke up screaming from a bad dream. He chose her. He chose her without hesitation, and he never once looked back. And if anyone had asked him whether he regretted it, he would have looked at them like they were speaking a language he didn't understand. So he took a quiet job, a simple job, a job where nobody expected anything from him except a clean floor and an empty trash can, and he came home every single night in time to make dinner, and he was there. He was there. That was the whole point. Sophia was 10 now, smart as a whip, sharper than he'd been at that age, and he'd been sharp. That was who Michael Carter was on the morning everything changed. A father with a mop, and a secret he had no intention of telling anyone. He noticed things. That was the part he couldn't turn off. You can take the engineer out of the lab, but you cannot take the pattern recognition out of the engineer, and Michael saw patterns everywhere he looked in that building. He saw the way the third-floor engineers rushed their code reviews on Friday afternoons because they wanted to leave early. He saw the warning lights blinking on the server room panels that everybody had learned to ignore. He saw a young manager named Doyle take credit in a meeting for a fix that his own junior programmer had stayed up until 3 a.m. to write. Michael knew, because Michael had emptied that programmer's trash at 3 a.m. and found the kid asleep at his desk. And more than anything, he saw the cracks. Not the obvious ones. The quiet ones. The kind that don't show on a balance sheet until the day the whole thing falls in on itself. He'd fixed a few of them over the years. He couldn't help it. He'd be mopping near an open terminal at midnight, and he'd glance at a stalled process, and his hands would move before his brain gave permission, and by morning, some catastrophe that nobody even knew was coming had quietly been erased. He never signed his name to any of it. He never told a soul. He'd write a small note in the maintenance log checked panel corrected fault. The kind of thing nobody ever read, and he'd move on. Michael Carter had saved Harrington Global Technologies more times than the company would ever know. And on that particular morning, it was about to happen again, this time in front of everyone. The word came down at 8:00 a.m. sharp. Michael heard it from the break room, where two junior techs were pouring coffee with shaking hands. "Today's the day," one of them said. "The Meridian demo. Every investor we've got is going to be in that room." "Don't remind me," said the other. "If Sentinel crashes, it's not going to crash. It crashed twice last week. It's not going to crash today." Michael wiped down the counter and said nothing. But he'd heard about Sentinel. The whole building had. It was the company's crown jewel, an AI security system they'd been promising the world for 2 years. And this morning, they were going to demonstrate it live to a room full of people holding hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd also seen the maintenance panel outside the main demo hall 3 nights ago. He'd seen the communication protocol, light flickering amber instead of steady green. He'd made a note. Handshake latency east relay. Flag for review. Nobody had reviewed it. Of course nobody had reviewed it. Michael picked up his cart and headed toward the 42nd floor, because there was a conference room up there that needed cleaning, and because he told himself that was the only reason he was going. I didn't quite believe it, even as he stepped into the elevator. The demonstration was already an hour in when it happened. Michael was in the corridor outside the main hall, running a cloth along the baseboards close enough to hear the CEO's voice through the glass doors. Emily Harrington's voice. Cool. Precise. Confident in the way that only people who've never been humbled can be. And what Sentinel represents, she was saying, is not just security, it's certainty. In a world of threats you can't predict, we're offering you the one thing money can't usually buy. Peace of mind. Polite applause. And then Michael had been waiting for, without admitting he was waiting for it. A hum. A hitch. The soft, sick tone of a system choking on itself. Through the glass, he watched the enormous display at the front of the room flicker once, twice, and then dissolve into a wall of scrolling red error text. The applause died. "That's one moment," Emily said, and even through the door, Michael could hear the first crack in her voice. This is a minor." It was not minor. Michael watched the engineers scramble. He watched them huddle around a laptop, typing frantically, muttering, pointing at things. He watched the investors in their $1,000 chairs start glancing at each other, start checking their watches, start doing the math on whether they wanted to keep their money in a company whose miracle machine had just died in front of them. He watched Emily Harrington stand alone at the front of a $200 million disaster with a smile frozen on her face, like a photograph of someone drowning. 90 seconds passed. Then 2 minutes. In a room like that, 2 minutes is a geological age. "Reboot it," one of the engineers hissed. "I'm rebooting it. It's not coming back." "Why isn't it coming back?" And Michael Carter, 42 years old, in a gray janitor's uniform, with his name stitched over the pocket where nobody ever bothered to read it, set down his cloth and walked through the doors. I wasn't invited. He wasn't expected. He wasn't anything to those people, except a man who was suddenly, inexplicably, in the wrong room. Heads turned. A ripple of confusion moved through the investors. Who is that? What is the janitor doing? An engineer named Prakash looked up, saw him, and actually laughed a short, disbelieving bark. "Sir, you can't be in here. This is a closed communication protocol," Michael said. Prakash blinked. "What? Your problem isn't the software." Michael crossed to the laptop, and something in his voice, not loud, not urgent, just certain, made the engineer step back without deciding to. "The software's fine. Your handshake between the East Relay and the main server is timing out. It's been degrading for 3 days. You didn't crash. You got disconnected." The room had gone completely silent. That's not," Prakash started. "May I?" Michael said, and he was already reaching for the keyboard. For one absurd moment, nobody stopped him. Later, every person in that room would ask themselves why. The truth was simple. He moved like a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and in a room full of people who suddenly didn't. That was the most powerful thing in the world. His fingers found the keys. He didn't rush. That was the thing that unnerved them most, the people who told the story afterward. He didn't panic type. He worked the way a surgeon works, the way a pilot works, when the engine's out and everyone else is screaming. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. A command line opened. Then another. Lines of text scrolled up the screen, and Michael read them the way other men read a newspaper. "There," he murmured. "There you are." "What are you doing?" Prakash whispered. "Re-establishing the handshake, manually." A pause. His fingers moved. "You've got a relay negotiating on the wrong port. Somebody changed a config value and didn't flag it. Probably last week." Behind him, an engineer went very pale. "When I bring this back up," Michael said, "it's going to fail once then catch. That's normal. Don't touch anything." He pressed a key. The wall of red text froze, then it vanished, and the giant display at the front of the room came alive, clean blue. The Sentinel interface booting from black to full function in the space of 8 seconds. A soft chime sounded. The system status indicator turned green and held. Steady green. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then from somewhere in the back of the room, an old investor with white hair and a hearing aid started to clap. Slow at first. Then another pair of hands joined him. Then another. And within 10 seconds, the entire room was applauding, applauding. Sentinel, applauding the miracle, applauding the recovery that would let them keep believing in the company they'd come to fund. They were applauding a machine. They had no idea. They were really applauding the janitor, who had already set the keyboard down, already turned, already begun walking quietly toward the door. He almost made it. "Wait." Emily Harrington's voice cut across the applause. "You, wait." Michael stopped. He didn't turn around right away. When he did, he found the CEO staring at him, and it was not gratitude on her face. He'd have known gratitude. He'd seen it on 1,000 faces over the years, from pilots and generals and men whose lives he'd helped keep intact. This was something else. This was calculation. This was a woman watching a piece on a chessboard move to a square where no piece was supposed to be. "We'll talk," she said. Quietly, so the investors couldn't hear. "In my office, when this is over." Michael inclined his head. "Yes, ma'am." He picked up his cart from the corridor and finished his rounds, and if his hands trembled a little, it wasn't from fear. It was from the old feeling. The one he'd walked away from 5 years ago. The feeling of a problem solved, a system saved a room full of people who'd never know he was the reason they got to go home, believing everything was fine. He'd told himself he didn't miss it. Standing in that corridor with the applause still echoing behind the glass, Michael Carter realized with something close to shame that he did. The office was on the 51st floor. All glass, all corners, the whole city of Chicago spread out below like a thing that belonged to her. Emily Harrington sat behind a desk the size of a small boat and did not offer him a seat. "Do you know what you did in there?" she asked. Michael stood with his hands folded in front of him, the way you stand when you've spent 5 years learning to make yourself smaller than you are. "I fixed a communication fault, ma'am. You walked into a closed investor demonstration. Uninvited. Unauthorized. You put your hands on proprietary company systems in front of $200 million in outside capital." She let each fact land like a coin dropped on glass. "Do you understand how that looks?" "It looks like the demonstration succeeded," Michael said. Her eyes flashed. She wasn't used to being answered. "Let me ask you something." She leaned back. "How does a custodian know how to do what you did?" And there it was. The question he'd known was coming from the second she said the word, wait. Michael had a choice right there. He could have told her. The whole thing. The aerospace career. The systems he'd designed. The reason he understood her machine better than the men she paid $500,000 a year to build it. 2 sentences would have done it. 2 sentences and everything would have been different. He didn't say them. He didn't say them because of the way she'd said the word custodian, like it explained something. Like it was a category that told her everything she needed to know about the man standing in front of her. And Michael was tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Tired of being a category to people. Tired of watching the men and women who kept the world running get walked past like furniture. And some stubborn, quiet, dangerous part of him wanted just once to see what a person like Emily Harrington did when she couldn't fit a man into a box. "I've picked up a few things over the years," he said. It was the truest lie he ever told. Emily studied him for a long, cold moment. "Here's what I think," she said finally. "I think a man doesn't just pick up the ability to manually re-establish a server handshake under pressure. I think there's more to you than a uniform. And I think," she folded her hands, "that whatever the reason a person who can do what you did, working the job you're working, doesn't add up. And I don't like things that don't add up, in my building. I've never been anything but honest about my work here. You entered a secure area to keep your company from losing $200 million. That wasn't your call to make." And there finally the composure cracked, and something raw came out from underneath it. Her voice rose. "Do you understand that it was not your place? You don't decide when to intervene. You don't decide what's broken and what isn't. You don't get to walk into a room full of the most important people I will ever pitch to and make me look like I can't run my own—" She stopped herself. But it was too late. He'd heard it. "Make me look like I can't run my own company." That was what this was about. Not security. Not procedure. It was about a room full of powerful people watching a janitor succeed, where her engineers had failed, and the terrible, unbearable arithmetic in her head that said, if the custodian could fix it, why couldn't they? And what does that say about me? Michael understood her then. Completely. Maybe better than she understood herself. She wasn't cruel. He'd met cruel. This wasn't that. She was afraid. She was a young woman who'd fought her way to the top of a mountain and built an entire identity out of being the smartest, most in-control person in every room. And this morning, a man with a mop had reminded her in front of the only audience that mattered, that control was an illusion she'd been selling to herself as much as to anyone. He could have said all of that too. He could have handed her the mirror gently. But you cannot give a person humility. They have to reach for it. And Emily Harrington in that moment was reaching for something else entirely. "People like you," she said, and her voice had gone flat and final, "don't get to decide what happens inside this company." The words hung in the cold, expensive air. People like you. Michael had heard a lot of things in his life. He'd heard the roar of jet engines and the silence of a room after a wife's diagnosis and the small, steady breathing of his daughter falling asleep against his shoulder. He'd heard generals thank him and pilots owe him their lives. He had never not once heard anything that told him more about a person than those 3 words. People like you. "I understand," he said quietly. "Do you?" "Yes, ma'am. I understand exactly." She fired him 10 minutes later. She didn't do it herself, of course. She had Richard Blake do it, the chief operating officer. A smooth, hungry man with a handshake like a closing deal, who came down to the maintenance level with a folder and a look of practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Michael Wright," Blake said, glancing at the folder like he needed to check. "Look, this comes from the top. Nothing personal. Security protocol violation. We can't have it. You understand." "I understand." "There's a severance." Blake slid the folder across the metal table. "It's generous. More than fair, honestly. 2 weeks. All we ask is you clear out your locker today and sign the, I'll sign it." Blake blinked. He'd clearly braced for a fight. They always braced for a fight. Great. That's smart of you." He recovered his smile. "You know, between us, what you did up there was impressive. Genuinely. Wrong place, wrong time, but impressive. If things were different. They're not, Michael said, and signed his name. He'd signed that name on a lot of documents in his life. Patents, classified specifications, papers that had changed how aircraft flew. He signed it now on a 2-week severance for a job cleaning floors, and his hand did not shake. He cleaned out his locker in 4 minutes because he'd never kept much in it. A spare pair of gloves, a thermos, a photograph taped inside the door of a girl with gap teeth, and her father's stubborn eyes holding up a fish she'd caught that was smaller than her hand and grinning like she'd landed a whale. He peeled the photograph off carefully and put it in his breast pocket. Walt was waiting by the loading dock when he came out. The old guard had heard. Everybody had heard. "This is wrong," Walt said. "This is flat wrong, Michael, and everybody down here knows it." "It's all right, Walt." "It's not all right. You saved their whole show, and they're throwing you out the back door like—" Walt's jaw worked. "In my whole life, I never understood how people up in those glass offices can look right through a man." Michael put a hand on the old Marine's shoulder. "You never looked through me. That's worth more than you know." "What are you gonna do?" Michael thought about it. He thought about Sophia, who would be home from school in 4 hours, who would ask about his day, the way she always did, who deserved to hear something true. "I'm gonna go home," he said, "and be a father. Same as always." He almost smiled. Turns out that was always the real job anyway. He pushed open the loading dock door, and the rain was coming down hard over Chicago, now gray and cold and steady, and he stepped out into it without an umbrella and without a backward glance. But he stopped once. He stopped at the edge of the dock just before the rain, and he turned around, and he found Richard Blake still standing there in the dry, watching him go with that smooth, satisfied expression. And beyond Blake, up through the maze of glass and steel. 51 floors above, Michael thought about the woman in the corner office. The woman who'd said, "People like you." The woman who was at that very moment probably telling herself she'd solved a problem. "Tell Ms. Harrington something for me," Michael said. Blake raised an eyebrow. "I'm not really a message service friend." "Tell her?" Michael paused, and the words came to him not as a threat, not as anger, but as a kind of quiet grief, the grief of a man who had seen a person choose to stay small. "Tell her I hope one day she learns to see people before she sees their job titles." Blake snorted. "That it? That's it. Sure thing, I'll pass it right along." He wouldn't. They both knew he wouldn't. Michael Carter turned and walked out into the rain. I didn't know. He couldn't have known that. Up on the 51st floor, Emily Harrington was already back at her desk, already moving on, already convinced she'd removed a variable that didn't add up. He didn't know that within 72 hours, a manufacturing subsystem 3 states away would begin producing errors that no one could trace. I didn't know that within a week, the same server handshake he'd been quietly stabilizing for 2 years, the one no one had ever known he was touching, would begin to fail across the entire network, cascading into 6 other systems he'd been silently holding together with the engineering equivalent of duct tape and prayer. He didn't know that a government contract worth more than everything Emily Harrington had ever earned was about to enter technical review and fail it. I didn't know that a woman named Lena Morgan down in Human Resources was going to pull a stack of dusty maintenance logs for reasons she couldn't even explain to herself and start reading them and find buried in 5 years of ignored unread notes the fingerprints of a man who'd been protecting the whole empire from the shadows. And he certainly didn't know that 1,100 miles away, an elderly woman named Margaret Harrington was going to hear about a janitor who got fired and go very, very still. Michael Carter didn't know any of that. All he knew, walking through the Chicago rain with his daughter's photograph in his breast pocket and a 2-week severance folded in his coat, was that he'd told a woman the truth about herself, and she hadn't wanted to hear it, and that this had happened to him before and would happen again, and that it had absolutely nothing to do with him and everything to do with her. He turned his collar up against the cold. Should have told her the whole thing, he murmured to himself. And then, after a moment, quieter. No, I shouldn't have. Because the truth he wouldn't fully understand for another 10 days when a woman he'd never met walked back into the empire she'd built and demanded to know the name of the man they'd thrown away, was that Michael Carter had never once been the one being tested. He'd been the test. And Emily Harrington had just failed it in front of the only person whose judgment had ever really mattered. Michael reached the corner. The light changed. And somewhere far above him, behind 51 floors of glass and certainty and cold recycled air, the first small crack had already begun to spread through everything Emily Harrington thought she'd built with her own two hands. He stepped off the curb and disappeared into the gray, an ordinary man on an ordinary street, carrying a secret worth more than the building he was walking away from, and not one single person in that whole glass tower had the faintest idea what they had just done. The first sign that something was wrong came at 6:14 on a Wednesday morning, and it came in the form of a phone call that woke Emily Harrington out of the first deep sleep she'd had in a week. She fumbled for the phone in the dark. "This is Harrington." "It's Doyle." The manager's voice was pitched high and thin. "We've got a problem at the Ohio facility, the manufacturing line. It's Emily. It's throwing errors we've never seen before." She sat up. "What kind of errors?" "That's the thing. We don't know. The system's producing defective units, but the diagnostics say everything's fine. Green across the board. Except we've got a warehouse filling up with product that doesn't pass quality control." Emily was already out of bed, already reaching for her clothes. "Have the engineers look at it." "They've been looking at it since 4 a.m. They can't find the cause." "Then they'll keep looking until they do." She hung up. She stood there for the moment in the dark of her bedroom, phone in hand, and she felt the first small flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly. She wouldn't have called it fear. She would have called it irritation. A problem had appeared, and problems were things she solved, and she'd solved this one too. She did not think about the janitor. Why would she? A manufacturing fault in Ohio had nothing to do with a man she'd fired 6 days ago for walking into the wrong room. She got dressed and drove to the office in the dark. By the time she arrived, the problem had grown teeth. Doyle met her at the elevator with 3 engineers trailing behind him, all of them gray-faced and jittery on too much coffee and no sleep. "It's spreading," he said before the doors had even fully opened. "Spreading how?" "The Ohio line went down completely at 6:40, and now we're seeing latency spikes in the main data center, the server cluster. It's the response times are climbing and we don't know why." Emily stopped walking. "The main cluster. The one that runs Sentinel." "The one that runs everything," Doyle said. For the first time, a cold thread of real worry pulled tight in Emily's chest. Sentinel was the reason those investors had signed. Sentinel was the reason her stock had climbed 11 points in a single afternoon. If Sentinel had a problem. "It doesn't have a problem," she said, and she wasn't sure if she was telling Doyle or herself. "It ran perfectly at the demo. It's been running perfectly for a week." One of the engineers, a young woman named Priya, spoke up quietly. "Ma'am, that might be the issue. It's been running too perfectly." Emily turned. "What does that mean?" Priya hesitated, glancing at Doyle like she was asking permission to say the thing nobody wanted to say. "It means for a system with this many known instabilities, it's been unusually stable. Almost like something was smoothing it out. And now whatever was smoothing it out..." She stopped. "Isn't anymore," Emily finished. The engineer nodded. Emily didn't understand yet. She wouldn't understand for days. But somewhere in the back of her mind a door opened just a crack, and a very small, very unwelcome question slipped through it. What changed 6 days ago? She closed the door. She had a company to run. By noon, 3 more systems had failed. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. A logistics platform that coordinated shipments across 4 states went dark for 20 minutes, came back, went dark again. The internal messaging system started dropping messages. And the server latency that Priya had flagged that morning kept climbing and climbing until by early afternoon, the engineers weren't measuring it in milliseconds anymore. They were measuring it in seconds. Whole seconds. An eternity for a system like theirs. Emily called an emergency meeting for 2 p.m. and packed her top engineers and executives into the war room on the 44th floor. And she stood at the head of the table and demanded answers, and she got nothing. "Somebody," she said, and her voice was dangerously level, "is going to explain to me why my company is falling apart on a Wednesday afternoon." Silence. Richard Blake cleared his throat. As COO, he'd made a career out of speaking when everyone else was afraid to, and out of making sure the words that came out never quite landed on him. "Emily, if I may, these systems are complex. Failures happen. What we're seeing is a cluster of unrelated technical issues that happen to have coincided. It's bad luck. It's not a conspiracy." "Unrelated," Emily repeated. "That's my read." Priya, sitting near the far end of the table, shook her head. A small movement, but Emily caught it. "You disagree," Emily said. Priya looked up, startled to be seen. Yes, ma'am, I do. These aren't unrelated. I've been mapping the failures against the system architecture all morning, and they follow a pattern. Every system that's failed shares a dependency on the same underlying communication protocol. The handshake layer between the relays and the main cluster." She swallowed. "The exact thing that failed at the investor demo." The room went quiet in a new way. "The demo failure was fixed," Blake said smoothly. "Everyone saw it. The system's been green ever since." "It's been green," Priya said, "because someone kept fixing it, manually, over and over. The logs show dozens of manual interventions on that handshake layer over the past 2 years. Small ones. Corrections. Someone was going in and restabilizing it sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, and none of us knew because none of us were the one doing it." "That's absurd," Blake said. "Who would be doing that without authorization?" And Priya, God bless her, said the thing that would haunt Emily Harrington for the rest of her life. "I don't know, but whoever it was, they stopped 6 days ago." The war room fell so silent, Emily could hear the hum of the ventilation. 6 days ago. She felt every eye in the room slide toward her, and then slide quickly away, because they all knew. Of course they knew. The whole building had been talking about it for a week. The janitor who fixed Sentinel. The janitor she'd fired. Blake jumped in, fast, too fast. "Now let's not get carried away and start giving a custodian credit for keeping a billion-dollar infrastructure alive. That's insulting to the engineering team. The timing is a coincidence." "Is it?" Emily said. It wasn't a question. It came out of her flat and hollow. "It has to be." Blake spread his hands. "The alternative doesn't make any sense. You're telling me a man who empties trash cans was secretly the load-bearing wall of this entire company. Come on. Listen to how that sounds. And the terrible thing was, it did sound absurd. It sounded impossible. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing a person like Emily Harrington had built her entire worldview to reject the idea that value could hide in a place she'd never think to look, that the most important person in her building could be someone she'd walked past 1,000 times and never once seen. So she chose to believe Blake. Not because she was certain he was right, but because if he was wrong, then she'd made a mistake, and Emily Harrington did not make mistakes. She made decisions. "Find the cause," she told the engineers, "the real cause, and fix it. I don't want to hear the word janitor in this building again." She walked out of the war room and did not look back, and she told herself she felt in control. She did not feel in control. That night alone in her office at 11 p.m., with the city glittering cold below her. Emily Harrington did something she hadn't planned to do. She pulled up the security footage from the day of the demo. She told herself she was reviewing the incident. She told herself it was due diligence. She watched the janitor walk into the room. She watched him cross to the laptop without hurry. She watched the engineers step back from him. Grown men, credentialed men. Men. She paid a fortune stepping back from a man in a gray uniform because something in the way he moved told them to. She watched his hands on the keyboard, and even with no sound, even from a ceiling-mounted camera 40 feet away, she could see that those hands knew exactly what they were doing. She watched the screen turn green, and then she watched something she'd missed in the moment. She watched the janitor stand up and turn and start to leave, not waiting for thanks, not waiting for acknowledgement, not even glancing at the investors who were applauding a machine he'd just resurrected. He simply walked toward the door the way a man walks away from a job that's finished. He wasn't performing. That was what struck her. He hadn't done it for credit. He'd done it because it needed doing, and then he'd tried to disappear. Emily paused the footage on his face. The moment right before she'd called out, "Wait." He didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like a man who'd violated protocol. He looked tired. He looked like someone who'd solved 1,000 problems that nobody ever thanked him for and expected this to be one more. I hope one day she learns to see people before she sees their job titles. The message had reached her after all. Not from Blake. Blake had never passed it along exactly as Michael predicted. It had come from Walt, the old night guard who'd cornered her assistant in the parking garage and refused to leave until the words got delivered to the top floor. Emily had read them off a sticky note that morning and thrown the note in the trash. Now at 11 p.m., staring at a paused frame of a man she'd thrown out into the rain, she found herself thinking about them again. She closed the laptop. "Coincidence," she said aloud to the empty office. Her voice didn't sound like she believed it. Down on the ground floor in an office that most executives didn't even know existed, Lena Morgan was also awake, and Lena Morgan was reading. She was the director of human resources, which meant that in a company like this one, she was largely invisible. A woman people came to when they needed to hire someone or fire someone or complain about someone and otherwise forgot entirely. She'd been at Harrington Global for 9 years. She'd watched 3 CEOs come and go before Emily. And she had never in all that time been able to shake the feeling that the building she worked in was held together by people whose names nobody bothered to learn. When she'd heard they'd fired the janitor who saved the demo, something in her had gone quiet and cold. So tonight, while the engineers upstairs chased ghosts through the server logs, Lena had gone down to the sub-basement where the maintenance records were kept. Actual paper records in actual metal cabinets, because nobody had ever thought maintenance logs were worth digitizing, and she'd pulled Michael Carter's file. It was thin. Employment records always were for people at the bottom. Hire date 5 years back. A clean disciplinary history. A single commendation from a facilities manager who'd since retired, noting that Carter was reliable, thorough, and unusually observant. And then tucked in the back of the file, the maintenance logs. Lena started reading them at 9 p.m. By 11, she'd forgotten to eat dinner. Forgotten to call her husband, forgotten everything, except the growing sense that she was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Because the logs weren't what maintenance logs were supposed to be. They weren't records of light bulbs changed and floors waxed. Buried between the ordinary entries in small, neat handwriting were notes like, "Server Room B Panel 4, Handshake Latency Climbing, Resynced East Relay, Flag for Engineering Review, Cooling Loop Data Center, Sensor reading false normal. Actual temp 8 degrees over threshold. Corrected. Flag for review. Manufacturing Uplink, Ohio. Config value changed without documentation. Reverted to stable. Flag for review. Dozens of them. Scores of them. Stretching back years. Each one flagging a problem the engineering department should have caught and didn't. Each one quietly corrected by a man whose job title said he wasn't supposed to know any of these systems existed, and every single one ended the same way. Flag for review. Lena went and checked. Not one of those flags had ever been reviewed. Not one. The engineering team had never seen these logs because nobody read the maintenance logs because they were written by the janitor, and who reads what the janitor writes. For years, Michael Carter had been finding the cracks in the foundation and quietly patching them and leaving polite notes asking someone with authority to please take a real look, and for years, not one person had. Lena sat back in her chair in the empty sub-basement and put her hand over her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. He was holding the whole thing up. And they'd fired him. Lena Morgan made 2 decisions in that moment. The first was that she was going to take these logs upstairs no matter what it cost her, no matter how many executives told her she was crazy, and she was going to make Emily Harrington look at them. The second decision, she didn't fully form into words. It was quieter than that. It was more like a certainty settling into her bones. It was the certainty that this company had a sickness in it, a sickness that had nothing to do with servers, and that the sickness had a name. And the name was the habit of looking straight through the people who kept you alive. She gathered up the logs and started for the elevator. By the next morning, the situation had gone from a crisis to a catastrophe. The main server cluster crossed a threshold at 3 a.m. that the engineers had been praying it wouldn't, and a cascade failure ripped through the network. When Emily arrived at 6:30, her systems were down. Sentinel, the crown jewel, the miracle machine. The reason for everything was offline. Not crashed, offline. The engineers couldn't even get it to boot. And at 8:15, the phone call came that turned catastrophe into disaster. It was the Department of Defense liaison. The government contract, the one worth $400 million over 6 years. The one that had made Harrington Global a national name. The one that required their systems to pass a rigorous technical review. Every quarter had entered its scheduled review that morning. And with half the network down and Sentinel dead in the water, they'd failed it. Not a warning. Not a probation. A failure. "They're pulling the contract," Blake said, hanging up the phone with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "Effective immediately pending remediation. If we can't demonstrate a stable, secure system within 30 days, it's gone. All of it." The war room was silent. Emily Harrington stood at the head of the table and felt the floor of her entire life tilt beneath her. $400 million. The government contract had been 40% of their projected revenue. It was the thing that made the investors trust her. It was the thing that made the stock climb. It was in every way that mattered the load-bearing wall of Harrington Global Technologies. And it had just fallen down. "Stock's already reacting," said the CFO quietly staring at her phone. "We're down 9%, and the market's only been open an hour. If word gets out about the DoD contract..." "It's going to get out," Blake said grimly. "These things always do." The stock closed down 22% that day. 22%. In a single day, Harrington Global Technologies lost nearly a quarter of its value, and the board of directors, the same board that had celebrated Emily's investor triumph 1 week earlier, began very quietly to place phone calls to one another. Emily didn't know about the phone calls yet, but she could feel them the way you can feel a storm before it breaks. She'd spent her whole career climbing, and for the first time she understood in her gut that everything she'd built could be taken back. That the mountain she stood on was not hers. That it had only ever been loaned to her, and the lender was starting to have second thoughts. That afternoon, Lena Morgan walked into Emily's office without an appointment, carrying a cardboard box. Emily looked up from a spreadsheet of falling numbers. "I don't have time right now, Lena." "Make time." Lena set the box on the desk. "This is more important than whatever's on that screen." Something in the HR director's voice, flat, certain, unafraid, made Emily stop. In 9 years, Lena Morgan had never once spoken to her like that. "What is this?" "It's the maintenance logs," Lena said. "Michael Carter's maintenance logs, 5 years of them." She pulled out a stack of files and dropped them on the desk with a heavy thud. "And I need you to read them. Because I think you fired the only person who understood what was actually happening inside this company." Emily's jaw tightened. "Lena, I appreciate the initiative, but I have a real crisis to manage. I don't have time for a sympathy campaign about a..." "Read one," Lena said. "Just one. Pick any of them, and then tell me I'm running a sympathy campaign." For a long moment, the two women stared at each other across the desk. And then Emily, mostly to end the conversation, mostly to prove Lena wrong, reached out and pulled one of the files toward her and flipped it open. She read the first entry, then the second. Then she stopped talking about not having time. Manufacturing Uplink, Ohio. Config value changed without documentation. Reverted to stable. Flag for review. Ohio. The manufacturing line that had failed first on Wednesday morning. The one nobody could diagnose. And here was a note dated 8 months ago, describing the exact fault, describing the fix, describing a warning that no one had read. Emily flipped faster. Her eyes moved down the pages, and with each entry, a cold understanding rose higher in her chest, like water filling a room. Server Room B. Handshake latency. Resynced East Relay. The handshake. The thing that failed at the demo. The thing Priya said someone had been manually stabilizing for 2 years. Michael Carter. It had been Michael Carter. All of it. Every ghost in the machine that her engineers were chasing right now this very afternoon had been caught and caged years ago by a man with a mop, and the only reason they were loose now was that she'd thrown him out into the rain. How many of these, Emily said, and her voice had gone strange, were ever reviewed? Lena's answer was very quiet. None of them. None. Not 1 in 5 years. Nobody reads the maintenance logs, Emily. They're written by the janitor. Lena let that sit. He was telling us. He was telling us every single week in writing exactly where the company was breaking, and we never even looked because of who was doing the telling. Emily Harrington set down the file. She stood up and she walked to the great glass wall of her office, and she looked out at the city that had felt like it belonged to her a week ago, and now felt like it was slipping through her fingers, and for the first time in a very long time, Emily Harrington had absolutely no idea what to do. "Get him back," she said finally. "What?" "Michael Carter. Get him back. Call him. Offer him whatever he wants. His job. 10 times his job. Consulting fees, whatever it takes." She turned around and there was something almost desperate in her face now, the mask cracking under the weight of 22% and $400 million, and a board that was starting to make phone calls. "He's the only one who understands these systems. He can fix this." Lena didn't move. "Lena, call him." "I already did," Lena said quietly. "This morning, before I came up here." Emily went still. "And?" "He didn't answer. So I drove out to his apartment on my lunch break." Lena's mouth twisted somewhere between admiration and grief. "His neighbor told me he'd taken his daughter out of the city for a few days. Said he needed to clear his head. Left no forwarding number." She paused. "He doesn't want to be found, Emily. And honestly, after what we did to him, I don't blame him." The silence in the office was absolute. Emily Harrington sat back down in her chair slowly like a woman twice her age. She looked at the box of logs. She looked at the falling numbers on her screen. She looked at the city that no longer felt like hers. And she understood finally with total and devastating clarity that she had made a mistake. A real one. Not a decision she could reframe. Not a variable she could remove. A genuine catastrophic mistake, the kind she'd spent her entire life insisting she never made, and it had a human face, and that face belonged to a man she'd been too proud, too frightened, too certain to see. "People like you don't get to decide what happens inside this company." She'd said that. To him. To the one man who'd actually understood what happened inside her company better than anyone alive. Emily put her face in her hands. "What have I done?" she whispered. And Lena Morgan, standing on the other side of the desk, did not answer, because there was no answer, because the only man who could fix what she'd broken was somewhere out in the country, with his 10-year-old daughter watching the empire that had discarded him begin to come apart from a distance, and owing it absolutely nothing. But even Lena didn't know the whole truth yet. Even Lena didn't know that the maintenance logs were only the smallest part of the secret. That the reason Michael Carter had understood those systems so completely was that he'd helped design half of them in another life, under another title, before he'd ever picked up a mop. That the quiet janitor Emily had thrown away wasn't a talented amateur who'd taught himself a few tricks. He was one of the most brilliant aerospace engineers his generation had produced. And there was one more thing that nobody in that glass tower knew. One final piece of the puzzle, sitting 1,100 miles away in a farmhouse in Vermont, where an 81-year-old woman named Margaret Harrington had just set down her morning newspaper, having read the headline about her company's collapsing stock and its lost government contract. Margaret had read that headline, and then she'd made a single phone call to a private number she hadn't dialed in 5 years. It rang twice. "It's me," the old woman said. "I saw the news." A pause. "I need you to tell me the truth, and I need you to tell me now. Is it true they fired you?" On the other end of the line from a quiet cabin by a lake, where a 10-year-old girl was learning to skip stones across the water. Michael Carter closed his eyes. "Yes, Margaret," he said. "It's true." The old woman was silent for a long moment. "Then I'm coming to Chicago," Margaret Harrington said, "and I'm going to find out exactly what kind of company my granddaughter has been running." The word granddaughter hung in the air of that Vermont cabin long after Margaret Harrington had ended the call. Michael stood by the window, with the phone still warm in his hand, and watched Sophia crouch at the edge of the lake, choosing her stones with the fierce concentration she brought to everything. She'd gotten one to skip 4 times an hour ago, and had refused to quit until she beat it. His daughter didn't know that 1,100 miles away, an old woman had just decided to walk back into an empire, and that her father was the reason. I hadn't wanted this. That was the thing he needed the world to understand, though he'd long since stopped expecting the world to try. He hadn't taken that janitor's job to expose anyone. He hadn't stayed 5 years to build a case. He'd stayed because the work was quiet, and the hours let him be home for Sophia. And because somewhere along the way, watching those systems he'd once helped design begin to rot from neglect, he hadn't been able to stop himself from reaching out at midnight and holding them together. A man doesn't stop being what he is just because he changes his uniform. But Margaret was coming now. And when Margaret Harrington decided to do something, it got done. Michael slid the phone into his pocket and walked down to the water. 4 times isn't the record, Dad, Sophia announced without looking up. I looked it up. Some guy did 88. 88. Michael crouched beside her. Then you've got 79 to go. 84. She held up a flat gray stone, inspecting it like a jeweler. You're bad at math for an engineer. He laughed a real laugh, the first one in a week. Who told you I was an engineer? Sophia gave him a look that was pure 10-year-old scorn. Dad, I've watched you fix the toaster, the car, Mrs. Alvarez's whole computer, and that thing at the grocery store that wouldn't scan the coupons. Janitors don't do that. She threw her stone. It skipped twice and sank. I know you don't want to talk about the before, but I'm not stupid. Michael was quiet for a moment. No, he said softly. No, you're not. He'd protected her from it for 5 years. The man he used to be, the life he'd walked away from. The reasons why. Not because he was ashamed. Because he'd wanted her childhood to be about her, not about the ghost of who he'd been before her mother died. But she was 10 now, and sharp as broken glass, and maybe he thought maybe it was time she knew that her father hadn't always cleaned floors. Someday soon, he told her, I'll tell you the whole thing, the before, all of it. Sophia studied his face. Is it a good story or a sad one? Michael thought about that. Both, he said. Most true ones are. 1,100 miles away at 9:40. The next morning, Emily Harrington's assistant knocked on her office door with a look of pure panic. Ma'am, there's someone's here, in the lobby. Security's asking what to do. Emily didn't look up from the disaster spreadsheet that had become her entire life. I don't have any appointments. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's saying her name is Margaret Harrington. Emily's pen stopped moving. For a full 3 seconds, she didn't breathe. That's not possible, she said. She's downstairs right now. She walked past security like she owned the place, and honestly, ma'am, half the older staff started standing up when she came through the door. Some of them looked like they'd seen a ghost. Emily rose from her chair very slowly. Margaret Harrington, her grandmother. The woman who'd built Harrington Global Technologies out of a garage and a patent and 30 years of refusing to lose. The woman who'd handed Emily the keys to the empire 5 years ago and then vanished into a quiet retirement in Vermont, answering no calls, attending no meetings, appearing at no events. Emily had assumed everyone had assumed that her grandmother was done. Finished. A legend put out to pasture. Emily had spent 5 years proving she could run the company better than the old woman ever had. And now the old woman was in her lobby. Send her up, Emily said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Margaret Harrington did not wait to be sent up. By the time the assistant reached the elevator, the old woman was already stepping out of it. 81 years old, ramrod straight, in a plain wool coat that probably cost less than the pens on Emily's desk, moving with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had never once in her life wondered whether she belonged in a room. She walked past the assistant without a glance and stopped in the doorway of Emily's office, and she looked at her granddaughter for a long, long moment. "Hello, Emily," she said. "Grandmother." Emily came around the desk. I didn't know you were coming. If I'd known you'd have cleaned up." Margaret's eyes swept the office, the spreadsheets, the untouched coffee, the exhaustion carved into her granddaughter's face. "That's all right. I didn't come to see a clean office. I came to see the truth, and the truth is usually messy." She walked in and sat down uninvited in the chair across from Emily's desk. And then she folded her hands and said the words that Emily would remember for the rest of her life. "Tell me about the man you fired." Emily's stomach dropped. "What man?" Margaret's expression didn't change. "Don't do that. I raised your father, and I raised your father to be smarter than that, and he raised you smarter still. Don't insult all 3 generations by pretending you don't know exactly which man I mean." A pause. "The janitor. Tell me about the janitor." Emily lowered herself back into her chair. How could you possibly know about that?" "Because I know everything that happens in this company," Margaret said. "I always have. You thought I retired. I didn't retire, Emily. I stepped back. There's a difference, and the difference is that a person who steps back is still watching." She let that land. "Now, the janitor. Tell me what happened." And Emily, cornered, exhausted, and out of options, told her. She told her about the demo and the crash, and the man in the gray uniform who'd walked in and fixed in 90 seconds what her engineers couldn't fix in 10 minutes. She told her about the security footage and her suspicion and the way it hadn't added up. She told her about the meeting in this very office and the things she'd said, though her voice faltered on the worst of them. And she told her about the collapse, the manufacturing line, the servers, the government contract, the 22%, the board that was starting to circle. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting. Her face gave away nothing. When Emily finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment. "You said something to him," Margaret said finally. "In this office, before you fired him. I want you to tell me what it was, the exact words." Emily looked down at her hands. "Emily." I said, her voice caught. "I said, people like you don't get to decide what happens inside this company." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Emily had ever closed her eyes. And when she opened them, there was something in her face that Emily had never seen there before. Not anger, which she'd have understood, but a deep and terrible disappointment, the kind that only comes from someone who once had enormous hope. "People like you," Margaret repeated softly. "Do you have any idea what you said? Do you have the faintest idea who you said it to?" "A janitor who—" "His name," Margaret said, "is Michael Carter." "I know his name." "You know his name. You don't know a single thing about the man who carries it." Margaret leaned forward. "So let me tell you. And when I'm finished, you're going to understand exactly how badly you've failed. Not the company. The company can be saved. You've failed something harder to fix than that." Emily said nothing. She couldn't. 15 years ago, Margaret began. "I read about a young engineer who solved a software failure in a military aircraft system that 3 separate teams of specialists had given up on. He didn't have the pedigree. He didn't have the connections. He was just brilliant, the kind of brilliant that comes along once in a generation, the kind you can't teach and can't buy. His name was Michael Carter, and I flew across the country to meet him because I have always believed that the single most valuable thing in this world is a person who sees what others miss." Emily's mouth had gone dry. "I offered him everything," Margaret continued. "A senior position, stock, a path to the top of this company, money that would have set his family up for 3 generations. Do you know what he said?" "No," Emily whispered. "He said no." Margaret smiled faintly at the memory. "He said he had a wife and a little girl, and that the job I was offering would eat his life, and that no title in the world was worth missing his daughter growing up. He turned down a fortune to be a father." Her smile faded. "And then his wife died, and he became the only parent that little girl had left. And he walked away from engineering entirely because he decided, and he was right, that his daughter needed a father who was there more than she needed a father who was important." Emily felt something twist in her chest. "I never forgot him," Margaret said. How could I? A man who understood at his core that a person's worth has nothing to do with their station. That's the rarest thing in the world, Emily. Rarer than genius. And Michael Carter had both. But the janitor's job. Emily's mind was reeling. Why would a man like that clean floors at his own? And here Margaret Harrington delivered the blow that changed everything. Because I asked him to. The office went absolutely silent. 5 years ago, Margaret said. When I decided to step back and hand this company to you, I had a decision to make. You were brilliant, Emily. You are brilliant. But brilliance frightens me because I've watched it curdle into arrogance more times than I can count. And I needed to know something before I trusted you with everything I'd built. I needed to know whether you'd become the kind of leader who sees people or the kind who only sees positions. She paused. So I called Michael Carter, and I asked him for a favor. Emily's hands had begun to shake. I asked him to come work here, not as an engineer, as a janitor, to become invisible, to watch from the one vantage point in any company where you can see everything and be seen by no one. I told him I needed to know whether the people at the top of my company still respected the people at the bottom, whether they'd earned the right to lead. Margaret's voice was very quiet now. He didn't want to do it. He said it felt like spying. I told him it wasn't spying. It was a test, and the person being tested would never know, and that's what would make the result honest. She looked at her granddaughter. He agreed to 1 year. He stayed 5. Do you want to know why he stayed 5, Emily? Emily could barely speak. Why? Because he kept finding things breaking, and he kept quietly fixing them, and he couldn't bring himself to walk away and let the whole thing fall apart. He stayed 5 years protecting a company that walked past him every day and never learned his name, out of nothing but decency. Margaret's eyes were hard now. And you fired him for it. You looked at the most honorable man I've ever met, and you saw a threat, and you threw him into the street. And then you had the audacity to tell him that people like him don't get to decide what happens in this company. Emily Harrington put her hand over her mouth. You were the test, Margaret said. Not him. Never him. You. Every single day for 5 years without knowing it, you were being asked one question when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain and no one important to impress. How do you treat the person who cleans your floors? She sat back. And last week in this office you answered. The full crushing weight of it descended on Emily all at once. Every day. Every single day for 5 years she'd walked past him. She'd let doors close in his face. She'd handed him coffee cups to throw away without looking at him. She'd complained once to Blake that the custodial staff should be scheduled to work when executives weren't around because it was distracting to see them. She'd said that to Blake. And Michael Carter had probably heard it or heard about it, and he'd said nothing, and he'd kept quietly saving her company anyway. I need to sit down, Emily said, and then remembered she was already sitting. There's more, Margaret said. How can there possibly be more? Because I didn't just ask Michael Carter to test you out of the goodness of his heart. I gave him a reason to care about the outcome. The old woman's gaze was steady. When Michael turned down my offer 15 years ago, I did something anyway. Something he didn't ask for and tried to refuse. I set aside a block of founder's equity in his name. A trust. I told him it was insurance that a man that valuable to the world deserved a stake in the future, whether he wanted a desk or not. He fought me on it. I won. A thin smile. I usually do. Emily was very still. What are you saying? I'm saying that the janitor you fired, Margaret Harrington said, is one of the largest private shareholders in this company. He has been for 15 years. The man you threw out into the rain owns a piece of the empire you were trying to protect from him. She let that detonate. You didn't fire an employee, Emily. You fired an owner. You just didn't know it because you never bothered to look. Emily Harrington did not speak. She couldn't. There were no words in her for a revelation this size. The intercom on her desk buzzed, her assistant's voice shaking. Ma'am, the board of directors is requesting an emergency session this afternoon. They're saying it's about your position, ma'am. They're talking about a leadership review. Emily closed her eyes. Of course they were. 22% down. A $400 million contract gone. A company in free fall. The board wasn't circling anymore. The board had landed. Tell them yes, Margaret said before Emily could answer. This afternoon. Boardroom. Everyone. Emily looked at her grandmother. You're going to let them remove me. I haven't decided what I'm going to do, Margaret said. That depends entirely on what happens in that room. But you're going to be there and you're going to face it because that's what leaders do. They don't hide from the consequences of their choices. They stand in front of them. She rose from her chair. And there's going to be one more person in that room. Someone the board needs to hear from. Someone this whole company needs to see. Emily's heart lurched. Michael. I called him this morning. Margaret walked to the door and paused. He's on a plane. He agreed to come after everything. He didn't agree for you, Margaret said, and there was no cruelty in it, only truth. He didn't even agree for the company. Do you know why he's getting on a plane to walk back into the building that humiliated him? She looked back at her granddaughter. He's coming because I told him the board might remove you. And Michael Carter, the man you called a threat, the man you told didn't get to decide anything, spent 5 minutes trying to talk me out of letting them do it. Emily stared at her. He was defending you, Margaret said quietly. The man you fired is flying across the country to defend the woman who fired him. Sit with that, Emily. Sit with what kind of person you threw away. And she walked out, leaving her granddaughter alone in an office that no longer felt like it belonged to her, with 3 hours to go before the board of directors decided her fate, and a man she'd wronged somewhere over Ohio, at 40,000 feet, coming back to a company that had never once deserved him. At 1:50 that afternoon, 10 minutes before the board convened, Richard Blake found Emily in the hallway outside the boardroom. Emily. He fell into step beside her, his voice low and urgent. I heard the old woman's here. I heard about the board session. Listen to me, this is survivable. But you have to get ahead of it. You have to give them a name. Somebody to blame for the technical failures. And I think we both know the cleanest option. Emily stopped walking. What are you talking about? The janitor. Blake said it smoothly, reasonably, the way he said everything. Carter. He had access to these systems for years. He admitted himself he was going in and altering them. We frame it as sabotage. A disgruntled maintenance worker who tampered with critical infrastructure and then walked out the door and let it all fail. The board eats it up, the story writes itself, and you come out the leader who caught it. He smiled. It's clean. It's already half true, and it saves your career. Emily looked at Richard Blake, really looked at him, and for the first time in 5 years, she saw exactly what he was. You want me to blame Michael Carter, she said slowly, for sabotage, a man who spent 5 years protecting this company for free. You want me to stand up in front of the board and destroy the one honest person in this entire building to save myself. I want you to survive, Blake said. That's my job. I protect the CEO. No, Emily said. You protect yourself. You've always protected yourself. Something was clicking into place in her mind. Pieces she'd been too distracted to assemble. The config changes, the undocumented ones. In Michael's logs, someone kept changing values without documentation, and Michael kept quietly reverting them. Someone was creating the very problems he was fixing. She stared at him. Was that you, Richard? Blake's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. That's a very dangerous accusation, he said softly, to make with no proof 10 minutes before the most important meeting of your life. Get out of my way, Emily said. And for the first time, Richard Blake's mask slipped just a fraction, just enough for Emily to see the cold calculation underneath. You're making a mistake, he said. Again. You're very good at those lately. He straightened his tie. When this goes badly for you, and it's going to remember I offered you a way out. He walked into the boardroom ahead of her. Emily stood alone in the hallway, her heart pounding, and understood that she was walking into a room that contained a board that wanted her gone. A grandmother who'd orchestrated her entire secret, unraveling a COO who'd just revealed himself as something far more dangerous than ambitious, and any minute now, a man she'd thrown into the rain who was somehow impossibly on her side. The door to the boardroom stood open. Emily Harrington took a breath, straightened her spine the way her grandmother had taught her without ever meaning to, and walked in to face all of them at once. Michael Carter's plane had landed 20 minutes earlier. He was already in the building. The boardroom held 12 people, and every one of them stopped talking when Emily Harrington walked in. She took her seat at the head of the table out of habit, though she wasn't certain she still had the right to it. Down the long length of polished wood sat the board of directors, men and women who'd smiled at her a week ago, and now watched her the way people watch a building they've already decided to demolish. Richard Blake sat among them, relaxed, unhurried, a man who'd placed his bets and liked his odds. And at the far end, in a plain wool coat sat Margaret Harrington, who said nothing at all. The chairman of the board, a silver-haired man named Prescott, who'd served under Margaret for 20 years, cleared his throat. "Emily, thank you for coming. I think you understand why we're here." "I understand you've lost confidence in me," Emily said. "In the space of a week. We've lost 22% of our market value in the space of a week," Prescott said, not unkindly. "We've lost a $400 million defense contract. Our core systems are, as of this morning, still offline. The confidence question rather answers itself." He folded his hands. "This is a leadership review, Emily. The board is prepared to vote on whether you remain CEO. I won't pretend the mood in this room is warm." Emily said nothing. There was nothing to say that the numbers hadn't already said louder. And then Richard Blake spoke, and the trap he'd built began to close. "If I may," Blake said smoothly, rising slightly from his chair. "I don't think this is entirely a failure of leadership. I think Emily's been dealt a terrible hand by circumstances outside her control. And I think this board deserves to know the truth about what actually caused these failures, because it wasn't bad management. It was sabotage." A murmur moved down the table. "Sabotage," Prescott repeated. "That's a serious word, Richard. It's a serious situation." Blake reached into a folder and slid a stack of papers toward the center of the table. "These are maintenance records. They show that a member of our custodial staff, a janitor named Michael Carter, had unauthorized, undocumented access to our critical systems for years. He was going into secure infrastructure and altering it. Repeatedly. Without permission and without oversight." He let that sink in. And then 1 week ago, this same individual was terminated for a security violation. And within 72 hours, every system he had access to began to fail. In sequence. Blake spread his hands. "I don't believe in coincidences that convenient. I believe a disgruntled employee planted failures in our systems and walked out the door, knowing they'd detonate behind him. Emily didn't cause this crisis. She was the victim of it. It was masterful. Emily had to give him that. It took every true fact and bent each one just slightly, and out of the bending, built a lie so clean it barely looked like one. Michael did have access. He did alter the systems. The failures did begin after he left. Every plank of it was real. Only the shape was false. And she watched the board begin to believe it. She watched relief move across their faces, because a villain is so much easier than a systemic rot, and blaming a janitor cost them nothing. Prescott turned to her. "Emily, is this accurate?" This was the moment. She understood that with total clarity. Blake had handed her a lifeline made of another man's reputation. All she had to do was take it. Nod. Say yes. That's what happened. I caught it as fast as anyone could have. The board would exhale. She'd keep her chair. And Michael Carter, who was at that very moment somewhere in this building, would become the man who sabotaged Harrington Global Technologies. And no one would ever question it, because who defends the janitor? Emily opened her mouth. "No," she said. Blake's head turned toward her slowly. "That's not what happened," Emily said, and her voice grew steadier as she spoke, as though the truth were a floor she'd forgotten she could stand on. "Michael Carter didn't sabotage anything. Michael Carter is the only reason these systems ran as long as they did. For years he found faults nobody else caught, and fixed them, and left written notes begging someone in authority to review the problems. Notes that nobody read. Because he was the janitor, and nobody reads what the janitor writes." She looked down the table at Blake. "The systems didn't fail because he sabotaged them. They failed because he stopped. Because we fired the one person holding them together, and then we were arrogant enough to be surprised when they fell apart. The boardroom was dead silent. Emily, Prescott said carefully, you're describing a janitor as the load-bearing structure of a billion-dollar technology company. You understand how that sounds? I understand exactly how it sounds, Emily said. It sounds impossible. That's precisely why it happened. Because it was so impossible to imagine that a man in a gray uniform could matter that much that not one of us, not one including me, ever looked. Blake recovered fast. He always recovered fast. This is very touching, he said, and very convenient. Emily needs a story that makes her the noble truth teller instead of the executive who lost us $400 million. But sentiment isn't evidence. The facts remain: the janitor had access. The janitor altered systems. The janitor left the systems failed. Everything else is a fairy tale she's telling to save herself. He turned to the board. I move that we not be distracted by a redemption narrative from a CEO fighting for her job. Several heads nodded. The tide was turning back toward Blake, and Emily could feel it, and she had no evidence, only the truth, and the truth. Without evidence is just a story. He's right, said a voice from the far end of the table. Sentiment isn't evidence. Margaret Harrington rose to her feet. So let's have some evidence. Every head turned. Prescott half stood. Margaret. Sit down, Charles. You've been letting other people talk long enough. The old woman moved to the head of the room with the unhurried authority of someone who had built the very walls around them. Richard, you made a claim. You said Michael Carter had unauthorized access and used it to sabotage this company. I'd like to test that claim against the record, because I've read those maintenance logs too. Every page. And I noticed something you apparently hoped no one would. Blake's smile stayed fixed, but something in his posture changed. The logs don't just show Michael Carter fixing things, Margaret said. They show him fixing the same category of problem over and over. Configuration values changed without documentation. Someone kept altering critical settings quietly off the books, and Michael kept quietly reverting them. For years. She let her gaze settle on Blake like a weight. So here's my question, Richard. If Michael Carter was the saboteur, why was he spending years undoing sabotage? And who exactly was creating the problems he kept fixing? The silence in the room changed temperature. I have no idea, Blake said. I'm not a systems person. I don't touch the infrastructure. No, Margaret agreed. You don't touch the infrastructure, but you approve the access credentials for people who do. Every override authorization in this company crosses the COO's desk. She turned to Prescott. Charles, I'd like the board to authorize an independent audit of every configuration change made to our core systems over the past 3 years, cross-referenced against the credentials used to authorize them. Today, before this meeting ends. Blake stood up. That's a witch hunt, and I won't sit here and... Then don't sit, said a new voice from the doorway. Stand. This is worth standing for. Every person in the room turned. Michael Carter stood in the doorway of the boardroom in a plain dark suit, and for a moment nobody recognized him because nobody in that room had ever seen him in anything but gray. He looked different in a suit. He looked like what he was. He looked like a man who had walked into rooms exactly like this one a long time ago and commanded them. Emily's breath caught. Michael walked into the room slowly, and he did not look at the board, and he did not look at Blake. He looked at Emily. And there was no triumph in his face, and no anger, and no cruelty. There was only that same quiet steadiness she'd seen in the security footage. The steadiness of a man who had made his peace with being underestimated a long time ago. Ma'am, he said, and inclined his head to her. Not mockingly. Genuinely. He'd called her that when she'd fired him, and he called her that now, and somehow it was the most dignified thing Emily had ever been called. Mr. Carter, she managed. I understand there's a question on the table about whether I sabotaged this company. Michael turned at last to face the board. I'd like to answer it, and then I'd like to answer a more important one. Prescott found his voice. And who exactly are you to address this board? That, said Margaret Harrington, is the most important question anyone's asked all day. She looked at the board. Michael Carter is the aerospace engineer I tried to recruit 15 years ago. He designed emergency systems that keep military pilots alive. He is, in my honest and considered opinion, one of the finest engineering minds this country has produced in a generation." She paused. "He is also, as of this moment, one of the largest private shareholders in Harrington Global Technologies. He has been for 15 years. He owns a piece of this company larger than anyone at this table except me." The room erupted. Prescott was on his feet. Two other board members were talking over each other. Blake had gone very still and very pale. And through all of it, Michael Carter stood calmly in the center of the room, waiting for the noise to die, the way a man waits out weather. "That's not possible," Prescott said. "A shareholder of that size would be on record." "It's a private trust," Margaret said, "structured through the founder's equity. It doesn't appear on the public register because it was never meant to be public. But it's real, and it's binding, and I have the documentation in my bag, if any of you would like to read it." She smiled thinly. "So, to recap, this board convened today to decide whether to fire Emily. And in the process, a COO stood up and tried to pin a company-wide failure on a man who is not only innocent, but who happens to be one of the owners of the company he's accused of sabotaging. Have I got that right?" Nobody answered. Michael raised a hand, a small quieting gesture, and remarkably the room quieted. "I don't care about the shares," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Margaret gave me that trust 15 years ago against my wishes, and I've never touched it, and I never intended to. I didn't come here to claim anything." He looked around the table. "I came here because I was told this board was about to make a decision, and I've watched this company make enough bad decisions from the inside to know one when I see it coming." "Then help us make a good one," Prescott said. "You clearly know these systems. Did someone sabotage this company or not?" "Someone made it fragile," Michael said. "That's different from sabotage, and it's worse because it's harder to see." He walked to the screen at the front of the room and picked up the controller that had been sitting untouched, and Emily realized he'd known it would be there the way he seemed to know everything. "May I?" Nobody stopped him. Of course nobody stopped him. He moved like a man who knew what he was doing in a room full of people who suddenly didn't the same thing that had happened at the demo happening again. And Emily understood now that it wasn't a trick. It was just what happened when a genuinely competent person walked into a room full of frightened ones. He pulled up the configuration logs on the big screen. "Here's the truth," Michael said. "It's simpler than sabotage, and it's uglier. For about 3 years, someone in this company has been cutting corners on the core infrastructure. Changing settings to make quarterly numbers look better. Turning off safety redundancies because they cost money. Pushing the systems past their safe limits and then covering the traces so it wouldn't show up in a review." He scrolled through the entries. Every one of these changes made the company look more profitable in the short term. And every one of them made the whole structure more fragile. I found them because I was cleaning up after them. 2-3 times a week for years. Reverting changes I wasn't authorized to see made by someone I couldn't identify because the traces were always erased. He stopped scrolling. Almost always. He highlighted a single line on the screen. "Whoever was doing this got sloppy exactly once. 11 months ago. They made a change and started to erase the trail and got interrupted before they finished. And the credential stamp survived." Michael turned around. "I've known who it was for 11 months. I never said anything because I had no standing to. I'm the janitor. Who would believe me?" His eyes moved to Richard Blake. "But I'm not the janitor in this room, am I?" Every head turned toward Blake. Blake stood up so fast, his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "This is fabricated. This man has every reason to lie. He was humiliated by this company and now he's—" "The credential on that change," Michael said quietly, "is COO override authorization timestamped 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday, when the building was empty, except for the security desk and one janitor cleaning the 4th floor. I remember that night, Mr. Blake. I remember it because I watched you come out of the server room and you looked surprised to see me, and then you looked at me the way people look at furniture, and you decided I didn't matter." Michael's voice never rose. That was the terrible power of it. "You were right that I didn't matter to you. You were wrong that I didn't see." The boardroom had gone so silent that the hum of the ventilation sounded like a roar. The audit. Margaret just called for, Michael said, is going to confirm every word of this. Every configuration change traced to a credential. And I think this board already knows whose credential it's going to be. He set down this controller. So no, nobody sabotaged this company by breaking it. Someone sabotaged it by making it look healthier than it was quarter after quarter to protect his own numbers and his own position. And the only reason it survived as long as it did is that a janitor kept quietly holding the walls up. And the reason it finally fell is that you fired him. He looked at Emily then. That's the part that isn't your fault, he said to her gently. The rot was here before you. Blake was cutting these corners before you ever took the chair. You inherited a company that was already sick. A pause. What you have to own is that when the one person who understood the sickness tried to tell you, you didn't fire him for being wrong. You fired him for being beneath you. That's the thing you have to live with. Not the collapse. The reason you couldn't see it coming. Emily Harrington looked at the man she'd thrown into the rain, and for the first time in her adult life, she had absolutely no defense. No reframe. No clever answer. Just the raw, unbearable truth of it delivered by the only person with the standing and the decency to deliver it. You're right, she said. Her voice broke on it. You're completely right. And that two words freely given in front of the board that held her fate was the first genuinely humble thing Emily Harrington had said in 5 years. Margaret watched her granddaughter say it, and something in the old woman's face shifted almost imperceptibly. Prescott Ashen turned to Blake. Richard, is any of this true? Blake's mind was visibly racing, hunting for the exit, and Emily could see the exact moment he realized there wasn't one that the audit would confirm it, that the credential was already on the screen. That the janitor he'd dismissed as furniture had been quietly documenting his crimes for 11 months. I want a lawyer, Blake said. You'll want several, Margaret said. Security removed. Richard Blake from the boardroom at 2:41 in the afternoon. He didn't go quietly. He made threats. He promised lawsuits. He swore they'd all regret it, but he went, and the door closed behind him, and the room he left behind was one that would never be the same. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Prescott, looking 10 years older than he had an hour ago, turned to the board. I think, he said slowly, that this leadership review has become something else entirely. And I think we owe it to this company to proceed very carefully from here. He looked at Emily. Emily, in light of everything, the board still has a decision to make. The failures happened on your watch. The contract was lost on your watch. Even if Blake is the ultimate cause, the market doesn't know that yet, and confidence has to be restored. Some of us are going to argue that a change at the top is still necessary. He paused. I won't pretend to know how that vote will go. And then, Michael Carter did the thing that no one in that room expected, the thing that Margaret had told Emily about, but that Emily hadn't fully believed until she watched it happen. He spoke in Emily's defense. Before you vote, Michael said, I'd like to say one thing. As a shareholder, since apparently I'm allowed to now. A faint, dry note in his voice. You're about to remove Emily Harrington to restore confidence. I'd ask you to consider that you'd be making the exact same mistake she made with me solving a problem by getting rid of the person, instead of asking whether the person could be part of the solution. Emily stared at him. 10 days ago, Michael continued, this woman told me that people like me don't get to decide what happens in this company. And she was wrong, and it cost her nearly everything. He looked at Emily, and his voice softened. But an hour ago in this room, she had a chance to save her own career by destroying my name, and she didn't take it. She told the truth when the lie would have saved her. Do you understand how rare that is? I've sat in a lot of rooms with a lot of powerful people, and I can count on one hand the number who'd choose an honest man's reputation over their own job. He turned back to the board. The Emily Harrington who fired me 10 days ago should probably lose her chair. But that's not the woman sitting at this table right now. Something changed in her this week. I watched it happen. And I'd rather bet this company's future on a leader who just learned the hardest lesson of her life than on a stranger who still has to learn it. The room absorbed that in silence. That's my position as a shareholder, Michael said. For whatever it's worth. I'll leave the rest to you. And he sat down finally in an empty chair near Emily, an ordinary man in a plain suit who had just, without raising his voice, taken command of the most powerful room in the building. Emily Harrington looked at Michael Carter sitting beside her, and she felt something she had no name for, something too large and too painful and too full of gratitude to fit inside the person she'd been a week ago. "Why?" she said quietly, just to him, under the noise of the board beginning to deliberate. "After what I said to you, why would you defend me?" Michael considered the question for a moment. "Because 10 days ago you looked at me and saw a job title," he said. "And an hour ago, in front of all these people, you looked at me and saw a man. That's the whole thing, Ms. Harrington. That's everything I came here to find out. Whether you could learn to do that." He almost smiled. "You did. Late. But you did. And a person who can learn that lesson is worth more to this company than one who never had to." Emily's eyes were wet, and she didn't bother to hide it. "My grandmother used you to test me," she said. "For 5 years. You cleaned floors for 5 years because of a test about me." "No," Michael said gently. "I cleaned floors for 5 years because my daughter needed her father home for dinner, and it was a job that let me be home for dinner. The test was Margaret's reason. It was never mine." He looked at her. "I stayed because the work needed doing, and because I was good at it, and because somewhere in there, I started to care what happened to this place, and the people in it. Including God, help me you." A pause. "I'm not a saint, Ms. Harrington. I'm just a man who decided a long time ago that how you treat the people who can't do anything for you is the only real measure of who you are." He shrugged. "You failed that test badly, and then you passed it when it counted most. That's more than most people ever manage." At 3:20 in the afternoon, the board of directors of Harrington Global Technologies voted. They voted 7-5 to retain Emily Harrington as CEO, but on conditions. She would report to a restructured board. She would submit to Margaret Harrington's active oversight for a transitional year. And the company would undergo a top-to-bottom audit and reckoning, beginning with the full extent of Richard Blake's damage, and ending with a complete review of how a company could function for years, while ignoring the one man trying to warn it. It was not a triumph. Emily understood that. It was a reprieve. A second chance she hadn't earned, and knew she hadn't earned, extended to her in large part by a man she'd wronged. When the meeting broke, and the board members filed out in stunned clusters, and the enormity of the day began to settle over the room like dust, Margaret Harrington walked over to where Michael and Emily still sat. "Well," the old woman said, "that was more dramatic than I intended." "You knew Blake would try to blame me," Michael said. "It wasn't quite a question. I suspected he'd try something. I didn't know it would be that." Margaret sat down heavily, and for the first time all day, she looked her age. "I set all this in motion 5 years ago to answer one question about my granddaughter. I never imagined it would uncover a rot this deep." She looked at Michael. "You knew about Blake for 11 months. You could have come to me. You have my private number. Why didn't you?" Michael was quiet for a moment. "Because you asked me to be invisible," he said. "You asked me to become someone nobody would listen to, and then watch what happened. And I understood the moment I found Blake's fingerprints, that if I broke character to expose him, I'd be breaking the thing you actually needed to know." He looked at Emily. "You needed to know what your company would do with the truth when it came from someone with no power. Whether anyone would listen to a janitor." A pause. "The answer was no. Nobody would. That's the real disease, Margaret. Not Blake. Blake's just a symptom. The disease is a company where the truth doesn't count unless it comes from someone important. Blake could do what he did for 3 years because everyone who might have caught him was beneath the notice of everyone who could have stopped him." Margaret Harrington was silent for a long time. "You always did see the whole board," she said finally, while everyone else was staring at a single piece. Emily looked between the two of them, her grandmother and the janitor, the founder and the man. She'd fired 2 people who understood something about the world that she was only beginning to learn. "What happens now?" Emily asked. "To the company, to the systems. They're still down. The contract's still gone." "The systems," Michael said, "I can fix. Most of it in a week, all of it in a month. The damage Blake did is real, but it's repairable now that we know what he did." He stood up, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that Emily hadn't seen before, the look of a man rolling up his sleeves for work he was born to do. The contract's harder, but if we can show the DoD a clean, audited, genuinely secure system in 30 days, there's a real chance. I know the people who run that review. I designed systems they still use. Emily looked up at him. You'd do that? You'd fix the company that fired you. I'd fix the company, Michael said. Not for you, not for the board, not even for Margaret. He looked toward the window, toward the gray Chicago sky, and Emily had the sense he was seeing something else entirely. A cabin by a lake maybe, and a 10-year-old girl learning to skip stones. There are 8,000 people who work here who had nothing to do with any of this. Walt at the security desk. Priya in engineering, who's smarter than half the executives and gets paid a third as much. The cleaning crew who come in at 4 in the morning that nobody ever sees. He turned back to Emily. I'll fix it for them. The way I always did. Because somebody has to hold the walls up, and it turns out I've never really been able to stop myself. And Emily Harrington understood in that moment that she was looking at the kind of leader she had spent 5 years pretending to be, and had never once actually been a person whose authority came not from a title on a door, but from something so much deeper and harder to earn that most people never even knew it existed. Teach me, she said suddenly. Michael blinked. What? How to do that? How to see them? All of them. Her voice was fierce now and desperate and more honest than she'd been in years. I've been the CEO of this company for 5 years, and I couldn't tell you the name of one person on the cleaning crew. I walked past you every day for years and never once looked at your face. I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't know how not to be. So teach me. Michael Carter looked at her for a long moment, and then slowly he nodded. All right, he said. But it doesn't start in this office, and it doesn't start with a title. He glanced at his watch, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It starts tomorrow morning, 4 a.m. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty. Emily Harrington, CEO of Harrington Global Technologies, survivor of the worst week of her professional life. A woman who had just barely kept the empire her grandmother built, stared at the janitor she'd fired. 4 a.m., she repeated. 4 a.m., Michael said. That's when the real work starts. That's when the people who actually keep this place alive clock in. He walked toward the door and paused and looked back at her. You want to learn to lead this company? First you're going to learn to clean it, same as I did. And he walked out of the boardroom, an ordinary man in a plain suit, leaving behind a CEO with everything still to prove, a founder with hope in her eyes for the first time in years, and a company that had just been given a second chance it did not deserve by the one man in the building it had never bothered to see. At 3:58 the next morning, Emily Harrington stood in the loading dock of her own building, wearing an old sweatshirt and jeans, and she had never felt more out of place in her life. Michael Carter arrived at exactly 4:00, the way she suspected he'd arrived at exactly 4:00 every day for 5 years. He looked at her, at the CEO of a billion-dollar company, standing by the trash compactor, in clothes she'd had to dig out of the back of a closet, and he didn't smile, and he didn't gloat, and Emily was grateful for that more than she could say. You came, he said. You told me to. I've told a lot of people a lot of things. Most of them don't show up at 4 in the morning. He handed her a cart. This is yours today. East Wing floors 3 through 6. I'll walk you through the first round. Emily gripped the handle of the cart, and it was heavier than she expected, and that felt right somehow. Walt's at the desk, Michael said as they walked. Say good morning to him. Use his name. He's worked here 11 years, and I'd bet you've never once said it. Emily felt her face go hot. He was right. Of course he was right. They passed the security desk, and the old guard looked up, and his face did something complicated when he saw the CEO in a sweatshirt pushing a cleaning cart at 4 in the morning. Good morning, Walt, Emily said. Walt blinked. Ms. Harrington. He looked at Michael, then back at her, and something in his weathered face shifted from suspicion toward something warmer. Well, I'll be. Morning, ma'am. They rode the service elevator up, not the executive one, the freight one, the one. Emily hadn't known existed, and Michael showed her how to hold a cloth so it didn't just push dirt around, and how to tell when a trash liner needed changing before it tore, and how to move through a floor efficiently so you didn't double back. Small things. Invisible things. The 1,000 small competencies of a job she'd never once considered required competence at all. And as they worked, he talked. "See this." He pointed to a spot on the carpet outside a conference room, a faint darkened patch. "Coffee stain, 2 weeks old. Somebody spilled it and didn't say anything, and now it's set. If they'd told the cleaning crew that night, it'd have come right up. Now it's permanent." He looked at her. "That's your company in a nutshell, Ms. Harrington. Small problems nobody mentions because they don't think the people who'd fix them matter, until they're permanent." Emily knelt down and looked at the stain and understood that he wasn't really talking about carpet. By 5:30, she'd cleaned 2 floors, and her back ached, and her hands smelled like disinfectant, and she'd learned the names of 3 other members of the overnight crew. Maria, who'd worked there 6 years and was putting a son through college. An old man named Sal, who hummed opera under his breath. A young woman named Destiny, who was studying for a nursing degree between shifts. Emily had walked past all of them for years. She hadn't known a single name. "How do you do this?" she asked Michael, as they took a break in the 4th-floor break room at 5:45. "And not become bitter. All these people working this hard, invisible to everyone upstairs, including me. How do you not hate the people at the top?" Michael considered it, wrapping his hands around a paper cup of coffee. "For a long time I did," he admitted. "Not hate exactly, but something close. When I first started, I'd watch executives walk past Maria like she was a piece of the wall, and I'd think, you have no idea. You have no idea who's holding your world together." He took a sip. "And then one day I realized the bitterness was just another way of caring about what those people thought of me. And I decided I didn't want to give them that. My worth doesn't come from whether the CEO learns my name." He looked at her, not unkindly. "No offense. None taken," Emily said quietly. "It should have, though. Learned your name. It should have." "Yeah," Michael said. "It should have. But that's on the company, not on you being owed something by strangers." He set down his cup. "The difference between us, Ms. Harrington, the difference that got you in trouble, is that you needed to be seen to feel like you mattered. I stopped needing that a long time ago. And a person who doesn't need to be seen is very hard to manipulate, and very hard to frighten, and very hard to stop." He stood up. "Break's over. 2 more floors." Michael Carter went back to work on the systems that afternoon. He set up in a small, unremarkable office on the engineering floor. Not a corner office, not anything with a view, just a room with a desk and 3 monitors, and he began methodically to undo 3 years of Richard Blake's corner cutting. Emily gave him whatever he asked for. Access personnel budget. Whatever he needed, no questions. What surprised her was how he worked. She'd expected a lone genius, hunched over a keyboard, brilliant and solitary. Instead, on his first afternoon back, Michael walked out onto the engineering floor and found Priya, the young engineer, who'd been the only one in the war room to see the truth, and he pulled up a chair beside her desk. "You mapped the failures against the architecture," he said. "In the emergency meeting. You caught the handshake dependency before anyone else." Priya looked terrified. Yes, I did. Was I wrong?" "You were the only one who was right." Michael pulled her monitor toward him slightly so they could both see it. "You've got a good eye, better than good. So I'm not going to fix this company by myself and hand it back to you like a magic trick. I'm going to fix it with you, and you're going to understand every step so that next time, and there's always a next time, you don't need me." He glanced at her. "That work for you?" Priya stared at him like he'd handed her the keys to a locked door she'd been standing outside of her whole career. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, that works." Word got around the engineering floor fast. The janitor, the shareholder, the aerospace legend, whatever he was now, wasn't hoarding the work. He was teaching it. He'd pull up a chair beside whoever was closest and walk them through what he was doing and why, and he learned their names on the first day, all of them. And he asked about their kids and their degrees and the problems they'd been trying to raise for years that nobody upstairs would listen to. By the end of the first week, the core systems were stabilizing. By the end of the second, Sentinel was back online. Not the fragile propped-up version that had crashed at the demo, but a genuinely rebuilt version, solid all the way down with every safety redundancy Blake had stripped out, put carefully back in place. And something else was happening. Something Emily noticed before she could name it. The engineering floor had come alive. People who'd spent years being ignored were suddenly being asked what they thought. Priya was practically running the rebuild alongside Michael. The whole department moved differently, faster, prouder, like people who'd remembered they were good at something. "You didn't just fix the systems," Emily said to Michael one evening watching the floor from the doorway. "You fixed the people." "The people were never broken," Michael said. "They were just never asked." He shut down his monitor. "That's the part nobody upstairs ever understands. You don't get great work out of people by managing them harder. You get it by making them believe their work matters. And it does matter. It always mattered. Somebody just had to say so." On the 18th day, Emily Harrington did something that no CEO of Harrington Global Technologies had ever done. She called an all-hands meeting every employee, every level from the board of directors to the overnight cleaning crew, and she stood in front of all 8,000 of them, and she told the truth. She told them about Blake, about the corner cutting, the fragility, the collapse. She didn't soften it, and she didn't spin it, and her communications team nearly had a collective heart attack watching her do it. And then she told them about Michael. 11 days ago, she said, her voice carrying across the packed atrium, "I fired a man for the crime of being better at his job than I was at mine. I fired the person who'd been quietly holding this company together for 5 years, because I was too proud and too frightened to imagine that someone in a janitor's uniform could matter that much." She paused, and the silence in the atrium was total. "His name is Michael Carter. Some of you know him. Most of you walked past him for years the way I did, and never learned his name. I'm telling it to you now because I never want anyone in this company to be invisible again. Not the engineers, not the cleaning crew, not the person who empties your trash at 4 in the morning. Every single person in this building keeps it alive. I forgot that. I almost destroyed this company because I forgot that, and I am never going to forget it again." She found Michael in the crowd. He was standing near the back, of course, with the maintenance staff. Of course, and she looked directly at him. "Mr. Carter, I owe you an apology I can never fully make. So instead, I'm going to make you a promise in front of everyone. This company is going to become the kind of place where the truth gets heard, no matter who says it. Where the person who cleans the floor is as safe to speak up as the person who runs the board. That's the company you tried to build from the shadows for 5 years." Her voice caught, but she didn't stop. "I'm going to build it in the light, and I'd be honored if you'd help me." The atrium was silent for one long heartbeat. And then Walt, the old security guard, started to clap. And Maria from the overnight crew joined him. And Priya. And then the whole engineering floor. And then, in a wave that rolled across 8,000 people, the entire company was on its feet, applauding. And this time, Emily thought, watching Michael Carter stand quiet and a little embarrassed at the back of the room, this time they knew exactly who they were applauding. He didn't wave. He didn't take a bow. He just nodded once, the way he'd nodded at her in the boardroom, and Emily understood that for a man like Michael, that quiet acknowledgement cost more and meant more than any ovation ever could. On the 25th day, the Department of Defense sent a review team back to Chicago. Emily had wanted to lead the presentation herself. Michael had talked her out of it. "You don't know the systems well enough to answer their hard questions," he said. "And they'll have hard questions. Let the people who rebuilt it present it. Let Priya present it." Priya's 29 years old. Priya rebuilt the security architecture with her own hands and understands it better than anyone alive except me. Age isn't the qualification. Knowledge is. He looked at Emily. "You keep saying you want to learn to see people. Here's a test. Do you trust the best person for the job or the person with the most impressive title?" Emily let Priya present. And Priya, terrified, brilliant, prepared down to the last detail, stood in front of a room of skeptical defense officials and walked them through a system so solid, so thoroughly secured, so completely rebuilt from the ground up, that by the end of the second hour, the lead reviewer set down his pen and said, "This is better than what you had before the failure. Substantially better. What changed?" and Priya, glancing back at Michael, who stood quietly at the back of the room where he always stood, said, "We started listening to the people who actually understood the systems, all of them, no matter their title." The DoD reinstated the contract 3 days later. $400 million restored, not as a favor, not on probation, but because the company had genuinely earned it back. The stock, which had bottomed out at a 22% loss, climbed all the way back and then kept climbing past where it had been before the collapse, because the market could smell that something fundamental had changed inside Harrington Global Technologies. But the number that mattered most to Emily wasn't the stock price. It was a survey. An anonymous internal survey her HR director, Lena Morgan, ran that quarter, the first honest one in years. Employee satisfaction had been sitting at 41% when Blake was cutting corners, and the executives couldn't be bothered to learn anyone's name. 3 months after the collapse, after Michael, after the 4 a.m. cleaning shifts, and the all-hands truth-telling, and the promise to build the company in the light, it hit 89%. Lena brought the number to Emily personally. "I've been at this company 9 years, Lena said, setting the report on the desk. "I've never seen a number like that. I didn't think a number like that was possible." "It wasn't," Emily said, "until we stopped treating half our own people like furniture." She looked at this report for a long moment. "You know what did this, Lena? It wasn't me. It wasn't even Michael exactly. It was the idea that finally got loose in this building that everybody counts. That's it. That's the whole thing. It's the simplest idea in the world, and we almost went bankrupt because we forgot it." 2 months after that, the board offered Michael Carter the position of chairman. It was Margaret's idea, though she was careful to let the full board arrive at it on their own. And Michael characteristically tried to turn it down. "I don't want a title," he told them in the same boardroom where he'd exposed Blake. "I've spent my whole life avoiding titles. I turned down the biggest one Margaret ever offered." "That's exactly why we want you to have this one," Prescott said. "You're the only person we've ever met who doesn't want it, which makes you the only person we actually trust with it." Michael looked at Margaret. "You put them up to this." "I told them what I told you 15 years ago, Margaret said. "The person who should hold power is the person who'd still care about people after gaining the power to ignore them. I found that person a long time ago. I've just been waiting for the rest of them to catch up." Michael accepted the chairmanship, but on his own terms. He refused the corner office on the top floor. He kept instead the small, unremarkable room on the engineering floor, the one with the desk and the 3 monitors near the people who actually did the work. He said an office should be close to the thing it was responsible for, and he was responsible for the whole company, and the whole company didn't live on the 51st floor. It lived down here on the floors where things got built and cleaned and fixed, and he instituted one policy, just one that would come to define the entire culture of Harrington Global Technologies for a generation. Every executive, every single one from the CEO down, was required to spend 1 full week a year working alongside every department in the company. Not observing, not touring, working. A week in engineering, a week in manufacturing, a week on the overnight cleaning crew, a week at the security desk with Walt. Not as punishment, as understanding. "You cannot lead people you've never seen," Michael said the day he announced it. "And you cannot see people from behind a glass desk on the 51st floor. So you're going to come down here, all of you, and you're going to learn what it takes to keep this place alive from the people who've been doing it all along, and then maybe you'll be worth following." Some of the executives grumbled. A few quit. Good, Michael thought. The ones who quit rather than spend a week cleaning floors were exactly the ones the company was better off without. The ones who stayed came back changed. Emily kept doing her 4 a.m. shifts. Not every day she couldn't, and Michael told her she shouldn't try to perform humility, that performed humility was just another kind of vanity. But once a week without announcement, without cameras, without anyone knowing. Except the overnight crew, the CEO of Harrington Global Technologies pushed a cleaning cart through the East Wing and emptied the trash and learned floor by floor the names of the people who kept her empire standing. Maria's son graduated from college that spring. Emily found out because Maria mentioned it at 5 a.m. over a paper cup of coffee in the 4th floor break room. And Emily set up a scholarship fund for the children of every hourly employee in the company and named it after nobody, because Michael had taught her that the best things you do are the ones you don't put your name on. One evening, nearly a year after the collapse, Michael Carter brought his daughter to the office. Sophia was 11 now. She walked through the lobby of Harrington Global Technologies, holding her father's hand, looking up at the great glass towers with wide eyes. "You clean this whole building?" she asked. "I used to," Michael said. "Now I run it, sort of. It's complicated." "That's not complicated. That's just weird." Sophia squinted at him. "Is this the before? The story you said you'd tell me? Is this part of it?" Michael crouched down to her level right there in the lobby of the company he now chaired, and he looked his daughter in the eye. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. "This is part of it, and I'll tell you the whole thing tonight, all of it, the before and the after." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "But I want you to remember one thing first. Okay? The most important thing. More important than any of the rest of it." "What?" "The reason I did any of this. The reason I cleaned floors, the reason I turned down all the fancy jobs, the reason I did the whole thing, it was always so I could be home for you, every night, for dinner." His voice went a little rough. "The empire, the shares the chairman thing, none of it ever mattered as much as being your dad. If I'd had to choose, I'd have picked being home over all of it every single time. You understand?" Sophia, 11 years old and sharp as broken glass, looked at her father for a long moment. "Yeah, Dad," she said softly. "I always knew that. That's how I knew you were something before. Because you never acted like the fancy stuff mattered. You only ever acted like I did." Michael Carter pulled his daughter into a hug in the lobby of Harrington Global Technologies, and if anyone had walked past just then and seen the chairman of the company holding a little girl and blinking hard, they would have stopped and they would have looked, because in that company, nobody walked past anybody anymore. That was the whole point. That was the thing they'd built. Emily Harrington was working late that night, and she came down to the lobby just in time to see it Michael and his daughter, the janitor who saved the empire and the little girl he'd chosen over every empire in the world. And she stopped, and she watched, and she understood finally and completely everything Margaret had been trying to teach her. Later after, Michael had taken Sophia home. Emily found her grandmother in the small engineering floor office sitting in Michael's chair, looking out at the city. "You knew," Emily said, "all of it, from the very beginning. You knew exactly how this would go." "I didn't know," Margaret said. "I hoped. There's a difference." She turned in the chair. "I couldn't have known Blake would nearly burn the whole thing down. I couldn't have known you'd fire Michael, though I feared it. All I knew was the question I needed answered, and the one man honest enough to help me answer it." "And the answer?" Emily asked. "About me. Did I pass?" "In the end?" Margaret Harrington studied her granddaughter for a long moment. "You failed the test I gave you," she said. "You failed it badly. You looked at the best man I've ever known, and you saw a threat, and you threw him into the street, and if that were the end of the story, I'd have taken this company away from you and never looked back." She paused. "But that wasn't the end of the story. Because the real test was never whether you'd treat Michael well when he was invisible. The real test was what you'd do after you failed. Whether you'd double down and destroy him to save yourself the way Blake would have, or whether you'd tell the truth when the truth cost you everything." Her voice softened. "You told the truth, Emily. In that boardroom with your career on the line, you chose an honest man's name over your own job. That's the answer I was really looking for. Not whether you were perfect, whether you could become better." Emily's eyes filled. "I'm not the same person I was a year ago," she said. "No," Margaret agreed. "You're not. And that transformation, that willingness to become someone better, that's worth more than if you'd passed the test cleanly the first time. Anyone can be decent when it's easy. It takes something rarer to fail and face it and change." She rose from the chair, an old woman who had built an empire and then risked it all to make sure the right person inherited it. "I'm proud of who you've become, Emily. I wasn't proud of who you were. There's no shame in that. That's just what growing up looks like even at 38. She walked to the door and paused. Someone asked me recently, Margaret said, why I let my own company be tested this way. Why I'd gamble everything I built on a single question about one person's character. She looked back at her granddaughter. Do you know what I told them? What? I told them I was never searching for the person who could control the empire. Any number of ambitious people could have done that. Blake could have done that. Her eyes were steady and clear. I was searching for the person who would still care about people after gaining the power to ignore them. Because that's the only kind of person who should ever be trusted with power at all. And that Emily is the one thing you finally learned. Late. The hard way. But you learned it. Margaret Harrington walked out, and Emily stood alone in Michael Carter's small office, looking out at the city that had once felt like it belonged to her, and understanding at last that it had never belonged to her and never would, and that this was exactly as it should be. The company didn't belong to the person at the top. It belonged to everyone who kept it alive. Walt at the desk, Maria on the overnight crew, Priya on the engineering floor, and yes, a janitor who'd chosen his daughter over a fortune and saved an empire almost by accident, simply because he could never stop himself from holding the walls up. Years later, long after the stock had made its recovery, and the story had become the kind of legend companies tell about themselves, a young business reporter asked Michael Carter the question everyone eventually asked him. Why? Why, with a mind that could have built or run anything with shares that made him wealthy, with every door in the world open to him? Had he spent 5 years cleaning floors for a company that never knew his name? Michael thought about the question for a long moment. He thought about his wife gone too soon. He thought about a 4-year-old girl who'd needed her father home for dinner, and the 11-year-old she'd become, who knew without being told that she'd always mattered more than any empire. He thought about Walt and Maria and Priya and Emily Harrington, learning to push a cleaning cart at 4 in the morning. He thought about the 1,000 small problems he'd fixed in the dark, asking nothing, signing nothing, holding a whole world together out of nothing but decency. And he gave the answer that would outlive him. The answer that got engraved eventually on a small plaque near the front doors of Harrington Global Technologies, where every person who entered the building would pass it executive and janitor alike. Because a person's value, Michael Carter said, should never depend on the name written on their office door. A title can create authority. Money can create power. Position can make the whole world step aside and call you important. But only character creates respect. Only decency earns the kind of loyalty that saves an empire when everything else has failed. And in the end, the measure of a person was never the office they sat in or the title on their door. It was and always would be how they treated the ones who could do nothing for them. Michael Carter had understood that his whole life, and by the time the story was over, so did everyone else.